if introverted talent are nurtured by their employers, they're going to thrive and they're going to perform at an optimal level. And that doesn't just benefit those individual employees, it benefits everyone, right? It's going to impact retention, it's going to impact productivity, it's going to impact profitability. And so by those making decisions for hiring, those in management roles, and those in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding introversion on a deeper level and understanding that introversion brings strengths and can be an asset to that workplace, and the ways in which they can support introverts, then that for me would be a very powerful way of improving the workplace for all.
Hello, and welcome to episode 143 of the Quiet is Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietisstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review. That would mean a lot to me. Tell a friend about the podcast. Help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Sam Sheppard is a coach, speaker, and learning consultant who's passionate about helping introverts to live life on their terms, freely and confidently. A highly sensitive introvert herself, Sam provides coaching and digital products for introverts who want to develop authentic confidence, as well as helping them escape the 9-to-5 while also working with DEI stakeholders to create more inclusive workplaces for their introverted talent. She has over 20 years experience of working in learning and development and is an ICF accredited coach. Sam has worked with hundreds of the world's leading brands, including Google, Amazon, GSK, across 169 countries globally. She's a keynote speaker for companies such as Salesforce and Jellyfish, and has coached executives so they can excel without having to pretend to be more extroverted. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Sam. Sam, it's so good to have you on the podcast today.
David, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do some great work. You know, we're connected on LinkedIn, and I love your LinkedIn posts. And we're going to get into all the work that you do helping introverts. And let's first start out with, tell us a little bit about your journey as an introvert and now to helping other introverts.
Sure thing. So as a child, I always felt like I was a bit of an outsider because I was an introvert, but at that point in my life wasn't aware of the terminology or what it meant. I just thought I was weird or different in some way. I much preferred my own company to the company of others. I didn't feel comfortable in groups. I just loved to sit and read and be immersed in my own imagination. And it was only really when I became an adult that I started to discover there was a name for the type of personality that I had and that I wasn't alone. And I think there's something really powerful in knowing that you're not alone and that there are other people that share characteristics that you have. But I had very low confidence for much of my life, throughout my formative years, but also into adulthood. And part of that was fed by this concept of I feel different, I feel weird, I'm othered, I don't fit in some way fundamentally, whether that be to society or the workplace, wherever it may be. And actually my confidence started to build independently of me being an introvert or appreciating my introverted nature. And that's because I've been working in learning and development for over 20 years now. And I consistently had very, very good feedback. And I always suffered with limiting beliefs and imposter syndrome. But the constant feedback that was telling me I was very good at what I was doing slowly helped to break down those narratives that I constructed and the limiting beliefs. And then a few years ago, I joined a project with Google called I Am Remarkable, which was focused on helping those from underrepresented groups to celebrate their accomplishments and break through glass ceilings. And when I was on that project, I was introduced to the term imposter syndrome for the first time and the concept of limiting beliefs as in concrete terminology for that. And I realized that not only is that what I'd been experiencing myself, but in the clients I was working with via Google, which was, I trained over 6,000 facilitators across 169 countries globally. So I was working with a huge audience. Those that were sharing the experience that I had had were primarily introverts. And it was fellow introverts that were struggling with limiting beliefs and imposter syndrome. And it makes sense if you think about it, David, because society tells us there's something wrong with us, even though we're 50% of the population. We're in a world which is biased towards extroverts and says that extrovert natural tendencies are the right way to be. And so that for me was the real light bulb moment where I started connecting all those dots, and I was able to do even more work on overcoming my limiting beliefs and navigating my imposter syndrome to become the best version of me so far, the most confident version of me so far. And now I legitimately see introversion as a superpower.
Awesome. So where did you discover the term introvert, and how did you discover what it was? What was there a certain resource that you used, or?
In all honesty, I can't remember a particular moment or a resource where I discovered the term. I just know that it's a term that I've been aware of for many years, but one that I didn't discover until I was an adult. But at the point that I was on the Google project and I had that realization that I've just described, that tipped me into research mode, because I do love to research. and I really immersed myself in research into introversion and discovered things like the neurobiology of introversion, which was a completely new concept to me. And it really clarified my understanding of what it meant to be an introvert, and also things like typically introverted strengths.
So it's part of our biology, right?
It is, like, our brains are literally different to those of extroverts. And something like the need to think and process before you respond to a question, that's a legitimate need because we have different biology in our brains, like the neurons are different lengths, for example. And so it's just how we're built.
Yeah, so we have a need, but it's also a great strength, because you were just talking about that you love to do research. And
Yeah,
that's part of your introverted gifts, I'm sure. It's we like to think deep. We're deep thinkers. That's what the heart of it is. We're deep thinkers. And
absolutely.
you're also a highly sensitive introvert. So tell us what it means to be highly sensitive.
So someone who's highly sensitive is someone who will potentially feel more deeply. Often we can feel the emotions of others, and we're more sensitive to our environment. So we will be impacted by, for example, loud noises or the weather even. And often people who are highly sensitive, again, feel that there's something wrong with them. But being able to be more sensitive to your environment, again, is an additional strength. It's particularly impactful in terms of our ability to empathize with other people and to more meaningfully help others. So anybody who's in a profession where they're helping other people, if they are highly sensitive, it's actually an asset to be highly sensitive in that context.
Yeah. And so as we're talking about introversion or being highly sensitive, there's gifts that come with it. There's needs that come with it. We're not all the same. For whatever reason, I'm not highly sensitive, because I've definitely had lots of conversations with folks like you. And I realize, yeah, you have a gift for some reason I don't have. I don't know why. But at the same time, my empathy comes from somewhere else. Instead of having the gift like you do of feeling other people's emotions, I'm thinking about other people. So I'm using my imagination and my introverted gifts of thinking and reflecting. And if I'm trying to help someone, thinking about, okay, what's it like to be Sam? Like what is she going through? And I'm using my mind. And so it's just different. And neither are good or bad. And that's something that I just really want to stress. And so not all introverts are highly sensitive. There's some highly sensitive extroverts as well. And these
True.
things are just all really important to understand.
I mean, absolutely, David. And I think that's the beauty of diversity. The world needs every type. It needs sensitive extroverts and sensitive introverts, but then also those that are more logical and thinking types. But rather than having a bias towards one particular type, appreciating that diversity and appreciating the unique gifts that each individual type of person brings would benefit everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well said there. So, what's a strength or two that you have because you're an introvert?
So you've mentioned already being a deep thinker. I am someone who thinks deeply about absolutely everything, and it means I'm particularly good at problem solving. And in my line of work, where I'm facilitating training quite commonly, or I'm speaking to an audience, having that level and depth of thought enables me to be able to pivot in accordance to what's happening in the moment in the room, which is why my training and my speaking has been so well received. And then combined with the highly sensitive aspect of my personality, I can feel what my delegates are feeling, and therefore I can respond accordingly. So it makes me much more conscious of what's going on in the room and able to adapt to it so that the people in front of me are having the best possible experience and are able to experience some sort of transfer.
Awesome. Is there any other strengths that you've seen in yourself or other people that you've worked with that come because they're an introvert?
I mean, as you mentioned, we're not a monolith, but
Yeah, right.
typically strengths that introverts share tend to be things like creativity, the ability to listen well, being highly observant, and therefore, again, if we're talking about being able to interpret what's going on for other people, if you're highly observant, often you are picking things up from other people's body language that the majority of the population aren't going to notice. Introverts also typically make great leaders, even though that contravenes how most people think of great leaders. And that's actually something I'm particularly passionate about, because with a lot of the clients that I work alongside who are introverted leaders, they are being told by their businesses that they don't have sufficient presence, or that there is doubt about their ability to be a great leader, even though they are having the impact that would evidence otherwise.
Let's talk about that. I was going to ask you next about some myths, and that's a big introverts can't be great leaders.
Yeah.
So, so why do you think that myth exists, or what is it? You mentioned that introverts can be great leaders, so why is that?
Why can introverts be great leaders? Just to
Yeah,
clarify
what
what
is
you're
it?
asking.
Yeah, yes.
So it's typically don't want to be in the spotlight. So therefore, as a leader, they are always thinking about the people that they are leading. And that's what makes them great leaders, because they're not seeking kind of their own personal glory. They're really thinking about what's going to make the difference and move the needle. So that, combined with the sort of strengths that we've just talked about, someone who's highly observant, who's empathetic, who's creative, who's a good problem solver, who's a deep thinker, who's not making rash decisions, they're thinking things through, thinking deeply, all of those things combine to have really positive outcomes. And there's quite a lot of research in this area that does evidence that when you've got introverted and extroverted leaders leading teams, introverts typically have better outcomes as leaders than extroverts, especially with team members that are more proactive themselves or self-sufficient themselves, because they allow those individuals the autonomy to make the right decisions to get those outcomes. The misconception, I think, just to kind of circle back around to the starting point for this question, comes from, because extroverted leaders tend to be more vocal naturally, they are perceived as charismatic and they're perceived as having like a bigger presence. And so that leads to the misconception that they're actually better leaders, when actually they're just more visible lead. And the research substantiates that it's actually introverted leaders that tend to have the better outcomes.
Awesome. Yeah, very good. Introverts can be amazing leaders and using their introverted gifts. And extroverts can too, but it's funny that people think that. And let me just go back to, you've said introverts make up half the population. So of course we're great leaders and we do many things. We just might do it differently. and we can be very successful. We just might succeed differently as introverted leaders, and that's a key to remember.
So
Is there
true.
any other myths that you want to bust today?
Yes, actually, it's around confidence and shyness. So commonly, introverts are thought of as being shy and socially awkward or socially anxious and lacking in confidence. And whilst that can be true, and I myself have had for most of my life, all of these things. So, in addition to being an introvert, I was shy and I was socially awkward and I was anxious and I lacked confidence. But not all introverts are shy. Not all introverts are socially awkward, and not all introverts lack confidence. And right now, as I've mentioned, I have stepped into my most confident self. My introversion remains the same, right? Like that's a very different thing. And so for me, that would probably be alongside the leadership aspect, the biggest myth. It's the introverts, they're shy, they're awkward, they lack confidence.
Yeah, and so some introverts have never been shy. And sometimes I think that's where the doubt comes about the 50% number, because there's some really
Yes.
quite confident, even outspoken introverts, and people aren't putting them into the introverted category, but they're deep thinkers and they have deep thinking gifts that come with that. And then there's introverts that were shy, like myself, and it sounds like yourself as well. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
my overcoming shyness was getting to know my introversion, was
Yeah.
getting to know, what, sometimes, quite often, I'm gonna think before I speak. It's normal. And as we mentioned, it's part of my biology. I'm gonna think first, but it's great gifts come from that. And sometimes I'm gonna need to recharge, spend some time alone. And it's not just for spending time alone, isn't just for recharging. I need some time alone to think strategically, to be creative, to have some focus, to actually get some work done. And understanding those things that I need to prepare before things like before a speech or a presentation, understanding those things for me helped me overcome my shyness and anxiety is
Mm-hmm.
and that's and I'm not shy anymore. And but the good news is, if anybody is shy, there are things that they can do to overcome their shyness. But like you said very well, we're always going to be introverts. We're always going to be deep thinkers. It's just, we can be confident about it. So tell us about that. I love reading on your website and your posts about being authentically confident. Tell us what that means to you.
So for me, authentic confidence is about feeling comfortable with who you are. And it's a bit like what you just touched upon, David. It's about understanding who you are and accepting it so that you can achieve whatever goals that you have without trying to be someone else or pretending to be someone else or pretending to be more extroverted. So my own journey has been one where I leaned into self acceptance and finally managed to become a confident version of myself through overturning imposter syndrome and limiting beliefs. And for me, that was authentic confidence because I don't want to be different. I don't want to be anyone other than myself. I'm accepting myself and I'm working very much with my strengths rather than trying to develop what I perceive as my weaknesses.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I think when I didn't understand my strengths, I thought they were weaknesses, but in reality,
Yeah.
what I thought was weaknesses were my greatest strengths. And once I embraced those, I found more success and happiness than ever.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of questions around introversion in general. Like we've talked about some of the myths, but really all introversion is the way we gain or lose energy. So gaining energy through alone time and losing energy through interactions with others, even if we are enjoying those interactions with other people. And it's about the needs that we've talked about already, things like having time to think, to process information. So a lot of the time, when you mentioned the 50% statistic, a lot of the time people are just not understanding what it means to be an introvert, and they'll say things like I'm an extroverted introvert, just meaning that they're charismatic or they enjoy social events. but really it's not. It's about how you gain or lose energy and your need to have thinking time to process.
Yeah, you might be getting me started on something. So it's so funny when people say that. I encounter that all the time when I'm talking with people, and they say, Well, sometimes I'm a little of both, and I'm like, okay, are you a deep thinker? Just because you can be social and you enjoy being social, that doesn't make you an extrovert. It just means that you're an
Exactly.
introvert being social, enjoying other people. But you're
Yeah.
still an introvert. And so often I find that people just want the label, like I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert or ambivert, which I don't particularly use, or I'm an extroverted introvert or introverted extrovert. That doesn't help unless you understand your strengths and your needs. The label is just a
Yes.
tool, but if you don't understand what your strengths are, the label doesn't matter. But just because you're being social or I'm on this I love podcasting. I'm not it doesn't make me an extrovert.
So true. I mean, in my spare time, I dance, and people are always
Yeah,
surprised
yeah,
when they
yeah,
see me at dance events because they're like, "But you're an introvert." It doesn't mean to say I can't dance.
yeah. Our fight goes on, right, Sam? So we got to keep
Indeed, it does.
busting these myths. Yeah, so anyway, and but doing the podcast, I do have to prepare, so I might have to prepare differently than an extroverted podcast host, but I still love it. It doesn't make me an extrovert. It just means that I did my work. I'm using my strengths, but I prepared, that kind of thing. So how do you help somebody gain confidence or overcome their limiting beliefs if they have them?
I mean, that's a very complex question, David,
Of
because
course.
firstly, it depends on the individual, but broadly, it starts with helping them develop self awareness. You mentioned yourself that in your own journey, having that understanding of who you were and your strengths was what really helped you. And that's why the foundation of any change is self awareness. You can't understand until you've got the awareness of what your limiting beliefs are, where they came from, the stories that you've been telling yourself, what's at the root of your imposter syndrome if you have it, or any confidence issues. And then once you have the self-awareness, you can start to break down and deconstruct and flip those narratives and overturn those limiting beliefs. So with my clients, I go into quite a lot of detail as to how to flip limiting beliefs and how to reprogram almost those narratives that you tell yourself. And with that comes a lot of time and a lot of practice as well, because we've got a default and we go back to the default. And so it takes time to overcome that. And then a big aspect of it is also something that you've talked about for yourself, which is the recognizing your strengths and thinking about how you can leverage your strengths and focus on those rather than perceived weaknesses to really get to where you want to be and do what you want to do.
Yeah. And you said earlier we all have different strengths, and that's important to recognize. That's part of it. Like you can't compare yourself to somebody else that has a different set of strengths than you do and think,
Mhm.
why am I not like that person? But instead, realizing why we each have our own strengths and, we have ours and the world needs ours.
Exactly. Working with what you've got.
Yeah. So speaking of working, how does this all translate into the workplace?
Can you clarify the question?
Sure. So how does understanding your introversion, why is it important to know in the work that you do? And or for people that are working for you.
So, if you understand your strengths and you understand your introverted nature, it's going to help you to make decisions that are the right decisions for you. By that, I mean there are people in the workplace that are feeling stuck and are feeling that they don't fit in and that there's something wrong with them, when actually there's nothing wrong with them. They're just in the wrong environment for them, or they're in a team that doesn't appreciate their introverted nature and is fueling those doubts about themselves. And so by understanding yourself, you are either able to communicate that to a manager if it's a role that you're happy in and you want to stay in, or you're able to make decisions and choices to free yourself from a situation that you're unhappy in rather than being stuck. Because some of the people that I've either worked with or interacted with as part of my work, they've been stuck feeling unhappy in what they're doing for years and sometimes decades because they don't feel that there's a way out for them. They don't feel that there's a way forward.
And I know that you do a lot of work with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, how is understanding introversion or extroversion part of that work?
So, workplaces, much like society itself, is biased in favor of extroversion. And most workplaces are set up in a way that makes it not a level playing field for the introverted employees in the organization. One example would be the open office structure that most offices have, because open offices are very overstimulating for introverts. It makes it very difficult for introverts to focus. There's so much noise, there's so much going on, and that's very draining and can impact mental health and well-being as well. Another example would be the way that meetings are structured. So most meetings are structured in a way that don't allow sufficient thinking time for introverts. And then those that are most vocal in the meeting are seen as, the most valuable players there, and that they're making a great contribution regardless of how valuable what they actually said was. And there's not really an opportunity for an introvert to contribute meaningfully to the way meetings are structured in typical work environments. And all of this means that workplaces are not an inclusive environment for introverts. And then if you layer in that of the 50% of employees who are introverted, of those employees, there are going to be individuals who are also facing other barriers at work. So whether that be on the basis of ethnicity or sexuality or level of ability, disability, etc., you've got that intersectionality aspect where they're already facing barriers to success, and then introversion becomes another barrier because of the way it's perceived. Quite a lot of introverts report that in performance reviews, managers are telling them that they need to be less quiet, for example, even if they're meeting all of their targets and overperforming in terms of their deliverables. The feedback is you're too quiet, you need to change fundamentally who you are because of these perceptions around introversion. And so for me, that makes introversion a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. And I believe that every company should have on their DEI agendas factoring introversion into how they're going to make their workplaces more equitable and more inclusive of employees. Because if introverted talent are nurtured by their employers, they're going to thrive and they're going to perform at an optimal level. And that doesn't just benefit those individual employees, it benefits everyone, right? It's going to impact retention, it's going to impact productivity, it's going to impact profitability. And so by those making decisions for hiring, those in management roles, and those in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding introversion on a deeper level and understanding that introversion brings strengths and can be an asset to that workplace, and the ways in which they can support introverts, then that for me would be a very powerful way of improving the workplace for all.
Awesome. How have you seen companies start to build this awareness of introversion, extroversion as part of maybe DEI work? What are
Honestly,
some of
David, it's a work in progress. So
yeah,
this is a vision that I have had since I left the Google project and started trying to build something around this. But it's, in all honesty, something that I am facing as a challenge at the moment, because the vast majority of companies don't see this as a legitimate need. There's a small minority of companies that make introversion part of their diversity, equity, and inclusion agendas, but they are the minority. And most of what I've been doing over the last 18 months is raising awareness to try and get this buy-in, but it is still very much a work in progress. And most of my clients have been introverts themselves as opposed to the companies.
yeah. And it's so important because if you don't understand your gifts, your strengths, your needs, you're not going to do your best work. And too often I see people that are brilliant, but their voices aren't being heard because they don't
Yeah.
understand how to make their voice heard. They don't understand how to, speak up in a meeting, how maybe they don't realize that they need to do some preparation. Just as an example, they need to do some preparation ahead of time, get the agenda ahead of time, just things like that. And that, or that the people in the meeting need to realize that they may not be talking nonstop, somebody else might be, but that doesn't mean that that introvert's idea isn't brilliant because they've thought it through.
Yeah. And for me, that's actually the bigger thing. When it comes to the workplace, it's less around the introvert recognizing their strengths, although that is very important.
Okay.
It's more around the systemic aspect of they are being told by their colleagues and their managers that the introverted nature, that being quiet is something that's a flaw, that's fundamentally wrong, that it's a barrier to their success, that they're not an asset to the organization. And at a systemic level, there is a misconception of introversion that is causing like workplaces to be non-inclusive and there to be a drain on talent. Because we've heard about quiet quitting, and we're aware that in a post-pandemic world, there's quite a lot of employees that are struggling with being told they need to return to the office. We're hearing more than ever about mental health and well-being issues in the workplace. And quite a lot of that is stemming from these systemic issues, in my opinion.
Yeah. So it's interesting because, like I said, I was definitely shy when I was younger through college and, thinking something was wrong with me. I've overcome that shyness. I'm very confident. I can be outspoken at times. And so, in comparison, I think I'm talking a lot, right? But the reality is, I may be talking far more than I used to, but I'm always going to be a deep thinker. And that's a good thing about me. And sometimes someone might say that I'm quiet, and I could take offense at that. But in reality, well, yeah, I'm always going to be quiet in some regard because I am going to be thinking. That's my natural way, As introverts, we think and then we put together what we think are the most important ideas instead of thinking out loud. And so what you're saying is, we can have the most confident introverts, but there still can be a bias in our organizations that think that person's quiet, even if themselves they're very confident. So there's a couple different things going on there. There's the bias that can exist, and also not really leveraging, like, having someone in an open office plan, like you talked about, when a different environment would be better. And then there's the introvert themselves learning to understand their strengths and needs. So, both of those things need to happen. And, how can we make our environments at work better for introverts? And how can the introverts themselves understand what they can do to have that authentic confidence that you talk about?
So for workplaces, it's about those people that are in charge of hiring, in charge of managing people, in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to take responsibility, take ownership for understanding what introversion means and what their introverted talent needs. You mentioned bias there. There's a proven bias in the hiring system, an affinity bias, that perceives introverts as being lesser in some way than extroverts. And I get a lot of people messaging me on platforms like LinkedIn saying that they had an experience where they've applied for a role, which isn't a role that would be one that's typically seen as an extroverted role. So, for example, a research position, which you would think would be great for an introvert. And when they had the feedback about not being successful for the role, the feedback was, oh, we thought you'd be too introverted. And there's no specific detail about what that means when they push. We just think you'd be too introverted, even though, like I mentioned, it's a research role or something along those lines. And the same happens for leadership positions, because there's an affinity bias in the workplace. As we've mentioned already, the perception is that extroverts make better leaders, even though statistically that's not true. And those hiring often are extroverts themselves. They are more likely to hire the candidate that's displaying extroverted tendencies than the quieter, more introverted candidate, regardless of qualifications, experience, etc. And that in itself is an issue. in addition to what we've already talked about, which is open office structures, meetings, etc. So by understanding introversion and the strengths that it brings, and by understanding the needs that introverts have, introverted talent can be supported and nurtured. And as I mentioned already, both the introverts and the companies will win in that scenario. And then for introverts themselves, by understanding their own strengths and how to leverage them, they are able to achieve on a personal and professional level wherever it is that they would want to achieve. And as I've already discussed, they're able to make better decisions for themselves to have optimum well-being as well as optimal success.
Yeah. Part of that bias, introverts can be guilty of it themselves. Introverts can be, maybe hiring or looking at how leadership should be. And sometimes introverts can buy into that extrovert ideal, like this is what a leader should be like. And so it's not just extroverts sometimes that might have that bias. So that's definitely something that we have to work on for all.
Yeah, so true, David. I publish a LinkedIn newsletter every Friday, as I think you know. And one of the editions, which was on introverted leaders, I had so many people commenting or messaging me who were introverts expressing surprise. And they weren't aware of the research that substantiates this, even though, it's quite widely available research. They were aware of the research, and they weren't aware that actually they would particularly be set up for having the strengths that leaders can use to excel in that role.
Absolutely. All right. So anything else that you would like to talk about as far as the work you do with DEI?
I think just if anybody listens to this, David, who's working in that field, just an invitation to be open to doing a little bit of exploration, even if it's not with me, just really, doing some exploration into what introversion really means, and really, understanding their introverted talent and their needs a little bit better, because that would really make a huge difference, not just to those introverts themselves, but to the business as a whole.
Awesome. We talked a little bit about in the beginning that, we definitely have needs. So just one last thing on needs. As we manage our time, it's definitely I wrote my first book on time management for introverts because as I was a very busy person and discovering my introversion, I realized, oh, there's some things that I need that aren't called out in these books I'm reading, right? So, do you have any tips? Have you found anything for time management, and how do you get your quiet time?
So personally, I made a spreadsheet to audit how I was spending my time and audit how my energy was impacted according to different tasks throughout the day. So for a period of 2 weeks, I'd go through, block out exactly how I was spending my time, and then color code where my energy levels were to be able to really see what was giving me the most energy, what was the biggest drains on my energy, and how that correlated to how I was spending my time. Because even though notionally you think what would drain, what would boost your energy, sometimes we are too in it to really have that awareness. So I made that spreadsheet, and it helped me to really be very clear on how best to spend my time to preserve my energy and boost my productivity as a result. And then I use that to really think about how I schedule my time. And it's things like, because I facilitate training, an example would be this week, Monday and Tuesday, I was facilitating leadership training, corporate leadership training, 2-day event. So then I deliberately didn't schedule in any meetings or anything that I would need to talk to a human yesterday, so that I had that space to recharge before, for example, this interview today. And it's because I'm very clear on what works for me and what doesn't. And actually, I've made that resource available to my clients now. I actually have that in my stands door. But yeah, for me, it was again coming back to that awareness and really getting an understanding of what drains, what gives me energy, and using that when I'm planning how I'm spending my time.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because again, you can do that kind of work because maybe someone would say, oh, well, she can't be an introvert because she's, doing this 2-day 2-day event, but you can absolutely do it. You have to prepare, and then you have to plan your recharge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not just the recharge after, like I made sure that the day before I wasn't interacting with humans either. So I had a quiet Sunday so that I had, that kind of buffer and I could recharge. I would be fully charged before the Monday, Tuesday. And then once I got home on Tuesday, that was it.
Yeah, I've heard that called pre-charge, and so I've used that. So
Great, Sam.
you pre-charge and then you recharge. And I think you said too, it's something you might really enjoy it, but it still you might need to recharge afterward. Because
Exactly. Oh, I love it. I absolutely love facilitating training, but I just
yeah,
need that time because
yeah,
it
exactly.
literally takes everything out of me.
Yeah. All right. And I am so enjoying this conversation, but I might need a break after just to be honest. And I plan that. So I don't schedule any just as the podcast example, I have at least an hour before and an hour after, and definitely you just got to think about that for whatever it is you're doing. Like, okay, do I need to prepare for this? Do I need to,
Mhm.
have time after this? And that's key.
And if I may, David, just on that and thinking back to what we were just talking about, that's not the way that most employees have their time structured. Because in most office environments, depending on the level that you're at in the company, you're in back to back meetings for quite a significant chunk of your working week. And the more senior you become, the more it's like a badge of honor if you're in back to back meetings, that the busier you are, the more your value is perceived as being higher. Yet for introverts, being in back to back meetings is the worst thing possible for their productivity and their well being.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like you said, we all have a varying amount of control over our calendars. And so, but as much as possible, if you can think about, okay, I'm going to need a break after that, if you can schedule it in. It's not always possible. And there's other strategies, but absolutely. Sam, this time has gone by really fast. Is there anything else that you want to talk about today?
Just that, just to give the kind of full picture on what I do, my passion is helping introverts to live the life that they want to live. So that's why I'm taking the approach of trying to get companies to make workplaces more inclusive for introverts. But what I've recently started doing, in addition to the authentic confidence, is for introverts who don't feel supported by their employers, helping them build that exit strategy. Because I myself have been free of the 9 to 5 for over a decade now. And so whilst I would like to support introverts in the workplace as far as possible, when it's not possible, I also want to support them to build a life that works for them on their terms without having to be an employee.
Awesome. All right. And then if people want to find out more about the great work you're doing, where can they get a hold of you?
So I'm primarily present on LinkedIn, as we've already discussed. I've got a website, and also I've got a stand store with some digital products to support introverts in the sort of things that we've been talking about today.
All right. I will put that all in the show notes.
Thank you.
Again, Sam, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to further connecting with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media channels. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. If you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there's now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code, and you can also have the option of purchasing the full report if you'd like to learn more. I'll add a link to the show notes. So many great things about being an introvert, and we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.